Tonight, friends, in today's episode, we share some spine-chilling national park horror stories. But before we begin, please consider giving us a like. We truly appreciate it. Also, if you've got a true freaky story of your own, send it to me, and I'll probably add it to a future video. Three weeks ago, I decided to take my 2.5-year-old son, David, on a camping trip to Mount Rainier National Park. It was supposed to be a bonding experience, a chance to step away from the stress of daily life and enjoy the beauty of the outdoors. The weather was perfect, clear skies and warm sun filtering through the towering evergreens. David was thrilled, his little hands pointing at birds and squirrels, his laughter ringing through the forest. We set up our tent in a secluded campsite surrounded by dense woods. It felt peaceful, almost too quiet at times. As the afternoon wore on, David's attention shifted to something in the trees. He kept pointing, his little face lighting up with excitement. "Monkey man!" he exclaimed over and over as if he'd spotted something magical. I followed his gaze but saw nothing, just shadows and swaying branches. Probably just his imagination, I told myself, smiling at his enthusiasm. But as the hours passed, his fixation grew. He stood at the edge of the campsite, staring into the woods and calling out for the monkey man. I felt a flicker of unease, but I brushed it aside, attributing it to the stillness of the forest. That night, as we settled into our sleeping bags, David whispered about the monkey man before drifting off to sleep. I stayed awake a little longer, listening to the silence outside, wondering why it felt so heavy. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke with a start. The tent was unnervingly quiet, and I immediately noticed David's sleeping bag was empty. My heart dropped as I scrambled out of my own bag, fumbling for the flashlight. "David?" I called, my voice trembling. I unzipped the tent and stepped into the cool night air. The moon provided just enough light to see the surrounding trees, their silhouettes tall and menacing. My flashlight beam darted through the darkness, searching frantically. Then, about 20 feet away, I saw him, standing motionless among the trees, his back to me. "David!" I called again, rushing toward him. He didn't respond or move, his small figure eerily still. When I reached him, I realized his eyes were open but unfocused, as if he were in a trance. He was sleepwalking. I gently scooped him up, whispering reassurances as I carried him back to the tent. His little body was limp but warm, his breathing steady. Once inside, I zipped the tent securely, double-checking every fastener and tie. David stirred briefly before falling back into a deep sleep. I lay awake for hours, my mind racing. How had he unzipped the tent in his sleep? Why had he gone so far into the woods? The unease from earlier in the day returned, sharper now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The next day started peacefully enough. David seemed unaffected by the previous night's events, his cheerful demeanor masking the unease that still lingered in my chest. We spent the day exploring nearby trails, playing by a stream, and enjoying the calm of the forest. But even as David giggled and splashed in the water, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The trees felt closer somehow, their shadows deeper, and the silence was too perfect, broken only by David's laughter echoing off the woods. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest transformed. The warmth of the day faded into a chilling stillness, and the shadows stretched longer, darker. That night, as we settled into the tent, David was unusually quiet. He clung to me as I read him a story, his small fingers gripping my shirt. "Monkey man?" he whispered once before falling asleep. I held him close, listening to the faint rustling outside and telling myself it was just the wind. Then I heard it, faint, distant but unmistakable, a sound like David's laughter coming from deep within the woods. My heart froze. It was the same pitch, the same rhythm, but it wasn't him. David was asleep beside me, his breathing soft and steady. I strained my ears, hoping I was imagining it, but the laughter came again, closer this time, then faded into silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then it spoke. A guttural voice, rough and low, came from just outside the tent, inches away from where I lay. It repeated my words to David from earlier in the night. "Not now, David." The tone was mocking, as if it understood the terror it was causing. Panic surged through me. Grabbing my handgun, I fired blindly in the direction of the voice. The sharp cracks of the shots shattered the silence, and for a moment, everything was still. Then came the sound of something fleeing, crashing through the underbrush, heavy footfalls receding into the darkness. I didn't wait to see if it would return. Shaking, I packed our belongings as quickly as I could, barely able to focus as my hands fumbled with the tent poles. David stirred awake, confused and groggy, but I hushed him, my voice trembling as I promised we were going home. Every sound outside, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had spoken was still out there, watching. With David in my arms and the remaining gear hastily thrown into my pack, we began the trek back to the car. The path was dark, illuminated only by my flashlight, which shook in my unsteady grip. The forest seemed alive with movement, subtle, fleeting, just beyond the edges of the light. The oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional distant rustling, a reminder that we weren't alone. David clung to me tightly, his small arms wrapped around my neck. "Monkey man," he murmured sleepily, sending a fresh wave of fear coursing through me. I quickened my pace, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the car finally came into view. The moment we reached it, I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could. The headlights illuminated the empty road ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Since that night, David hasn't been the same. He is now quiet and withdrawn. He's been complaining of headaches, clutching his temples with a pained expression that no amount of medicine seems to soothe. We reported the incident to the park rangers, but they dismissed it as a combination of wildlife and overactive imagination. If you're a parent, my advice is simple. Don't ever take your kids to Mount Rainier. The wilderness near Mount Rainier had always drawn me in. There was something about its vast, untouched beauty that offered a perfect escape from the noise of daily life. This trip was meant to be no different, a week of solitude, camping far from official sites, deep in the heart of the wild. I planned every detail meticulously, mapping out my route and packing enough supplies to last the trip. The thought of being entirely alone, surrounded only by nature, was both thrilling and calming. The first few days went exactly as planned. The quiet was restorative, and the world felt vast and endless as I moved through dense forests and crossed small streams. Each night, I built a modest fire, letting its warmth keep the darkness at bay as I fell asleep to the sounds of the wild. But on the fourth night, everything changed. I woke suddenly, the kind of awakening where you don't know what startled you, but your heart is already racing. For a moment, I thought it was just a noise, a branch snapping, maybe an animal moving through the brush. But as I peered through the thin fabric of my tent, the faint glow of embers from my fire revealed a figure. Someone was sitting by the fire pit, no more than 10 feet from my tent. My mind scrambled to make sense of what I was seeing. The man looked ordinary, disheveled but not dirty, wearing simple clothes. He had no gear with him, no pack or tools. Just sitting there, staring into the dying fire. When he turned his head and saw me looking, his eyes widened in what I can only describe as fear. Without a word, he bolted into the woods, disappearing so quickly I barely had time to process it. I sat frozen in my tent, my breath shallow as I listened for any sign of his return. The forest was silent, unnervingly so, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I convinced myself it was nothing more than a strange coincidence, maybe a drifter or someone lost. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that lingered as I drifted back to sleep. 2 days later, I had put considerable distance between myself and that campsite. I'd hiked nearly 15 miles in a completely new direction, choosing a spot surrounded by thick trees and far from any obvious trails. I told myself the man was just a fluke, an odd encounter that didn't mean anything, but the memory of his wide eyes and sudden flight gnawed at the back of my mind. That night, as I sat by my fire, the forest felt heavier, the stillness pressing in like a tangible weight. Then, faintly at first, I heard it, a noise from the darkness. It wasn't an animal, it was unmistakably human. A branch snapped, then a shuffle of leaves. I called out, "Hello?" trying to keep my voice steady. For a moment, there was silence. Then a voice responded, distant but clear. "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" The question took me off guard. I'd never heard of Bell's Canyon. It didn't even sound like a real place. No, I replied hesitantly, my voice carrying into the void. The forest fell silent again, but the unease in my chest grew heavier. Then the voice came again, closer this time. It asked another question, something unrelated, almost nonsensical. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was out there wasn't lost. They were playing a game. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. As the beam cut through the darkness, I saw him, the same man from 2 nights ago. He was just beyond the tree line, standing motionless, his face partially illuminated. His expression was blank, almost unreadable, and the moment the light hit him, he bolted again, disappearing into the trees as quickly as before. My heart raced as I sat by the fire, gripping the flashlight with white-knuckled hands. This was no coincidence. He had followed me, trekked miles through dense wilderness, and for what? I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't safe anymore. That second encounter shattered any illusion of safety I had. This man wasn't lost or some harmless drifter. He was following me. The thought of how far he'd come, tracking me over miles of dense wilderness, sent a chill through my entire body. This wasn't random. He had a purpose, and I didn't want to wait around to find out what it was. I sat by the fire for hours, every sound amplified by my fear. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, they all felt intentional, as though he was letting me know he was still out there, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Sleep was out of the question. My mind raced with plans, each one punctuated by the nagging realization that I was entirely alone. At first light, I packed my things and left the site. I had no clear destination, just the knowledge that I needed to get back to civilization. I decided to retrace my steps, heading back toward the trailhead where my car was parked. It was a 3-day hike, and I knew I'd need to keep moving and take every precaution to avoid being followed. As I moved through the forest, the oppressive feeling of being watched never left me. The man was out there, I was sure of it, and every step I took felt like a gamble, wondering if he was just waiting for the right moment. Each night on the trail was worse than the last. The first night, I set up camp in a secluded spot, surrounded by thick trees. I built a small fire, more for comfort than warmth, but I couldn't relax. I stayed awake, listening to the night, my hand resting on the handle of the knife I carried. Then, just as sleep began to creep in, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling my tent. My breath caught in my throat as I clutched the knife tighter, every muscle in my body tense. The steps stopped just beyond the tent, and then came a sound that made my blood run cold, a low, guttural laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakably human. I stayed frozen, too terrified to move, until the sound faded into the night. I didn't dare step outside. Instead, I sat there, gripping the knife and waiting for the first light of dawn. When morning came, I quickly packed my things and kept moving, my body heavy with exhaustion, but driven by sheer panic. The second night was much the same, though this time, the noises came from farther away, distant calls that sounded like someone poorly imitating animal sounds. Each one sent a shiver down my spine, the forest itself feeling hostile. I didn't see him again, but I didn't need to. He was out there, stalking me, waiting for me to slip up. By the third day, my nerves were frayed, and my body felt like it was running on fumes. Every sound in the forest felt amplified, every shadow a potential threat. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, the relief was so overwhelming I almost collapsed. I didn't waste a second, throwing my pack into the back seat and locking the doors before I even started the engine. On the road, I began to ask myself, who was he? What did he want? And why had he gone to such lengths to follow me through miles of wilderness? The questions raced through my mind, unanswered and unsettling. When I reached a ranger station, I reported what had happened. They listened carefully, but had little to offer in terms of help. It could have been a drifter or someone squatting in the area, one of them suggested. But their words felt hollow. This wasn't just some random encounter. This man had hunted me. It was supposed to be a peaceful day. My husband and I had decided to take our newborn son, David, on a walk through our local state park. The sun was shining and the weather was perfect. one of those rare days where everything feels calm and right with the world. We packed the stroller and some essentials, eager to enjoy the fresh air and reconnect with nature. The trail was lined with towering trees, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. We strolled at an easy pace, chatting and stopping occasionally to admire the scenery. David slept soundly in his stroller, his tiny breaths barely audible above the natural symphony of the woods. It felt like one of those idyllic moments you treasure as a family. But as we moved along the trail, a car slowed down as it passed us. At first, I thought nothing of it. People often slow down to take in the sights or navigate a tricky turn. But something about the way the occupants stared, their eyes fixated not on us, but on David in the stroller, sent a prickle of unease up my spine. My husband noticed it too, but we tried to brush it off, exchanging a look and continuing on our way. The first encounter unsettled us, but we were determined not to let it ruin our day. As we approached the next parking lot, my heart sank. The same car was there, parked and idle. Two men stepped out, each holding a small dog on a leash. They moved in different directions, splitting up as though to cover more ground. A third man remained in the driver's seat, the car's engine still running. My husband and I exchanged another uneasy glance. We didn't speak, but the shared tension in the moment was palpable. The men didn't approach us directly, but their presence felt calculated, almost purposeful. Something about their movements didn't sit right. Still, we pushed on, telling ourselves it was just a coincidence. They're probably just walking their dogs, I thought, though the reassurance felt hollow. A little further down the trail, the car reappeared in another parking lot. This time, the men were staring directly at us. The moment they noticed us looking, they jumped into the car and began driving slowly behind us. My pulse quickened as the gap between us and the vehicle narrowed. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as though we were prey being tracked. We decided to stop at a picnic table, hoping they would simply drive past and leave us alone, but they didn't. The car stopped at a nearby stop sign just within sight, and they sat there watching. Time seemed to stretch as they lingered, the tension growing unbearable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, another car approached, and they drove off. Relieved but deeply unsettled, we decided to head back toward the park's central store. We hoped to find safety there, but as we approached a bridge we had to cross, the car appeared again. This time, my husband made sure to get their license plate and vehicle description. It was clear this wasn't a misunderstanding. These men were following us. By the time we reached the bridge, every nerve in my body was on edge. The car reappeared, moving slowly along the road near us. My husband, calm but visibly tense, pulled out his phone and began typing their license plate and vehicle description into a note. "We're reporting this," he said under his breath, his voice steady but firm. I nodded, gripping the stroller tightly and glancing over my shoulder at David, who was thankfully still asleep. The men weren't subtle. As we crossed the bridge, they pulled over and parked, the car positioned to keep us in view. For a moment, I thought they might get out again, but they stayed put, their presence unnerving enough without any further action. We quickened our pace, our goal now singular: make it to the park's central store, where there would be people, light, and hopefully a sense of security. Reaching the store felt like a small victory. Inside, the warm glow of the lights and the hum of other visitors offered a brief reprieve from the oppressive paranoia that had gripped me. My husband went straight to the counter, explaining the situation and asking to use the phone to call the sheriff. I stayed outside with David, trying to act normal, but scanning the area for any sign of the car. It didn't take long for them to reappear. They parked across the street this time, the same two men stepping out with their small dogs. They kept their distance, staying just far enough to avoid suspicion, but their intent was clear. They were watching us. As the men lingered across the street, my heart pounded in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to stay close to the store, to keep David and myself in the open where others could see us. The store employees, sensing my distress, came outside and stood with me. "You're not alone," one of them said, her kind words doing little to ease the icy fear creeping through me, but her presence was comforting nonetheless. Inside, my husband was on the phone with the sheriff, giving every detail he could: the car's make and model, the license plate, the number of men, and their behavior. Meanwhile, the men across the street remained eerily calm, one of them casually pacing with his dog while the other leaned against the car, his eyes fixed on us. It was clear they weren't worried about being noticed. If anything, they wanted us to see them. One of the employees quietly pointed to a spot behind the parked car. "I saw one of them standing back there earlier," she said, her voice low. "He was watching you the whole time, but you wouldn't have seen him." Her words sent a fresh wave of fear through me. These men were methodical, calculating. This wasn't random. The sheriff arrived within minutes, his flashing lights cutting through the tension. The moment the men saw the patrol car, they jumped into their vehicle and sped off, their sudden urgency making it clear they had something to hide. The sheriff stayed to take our statements, assuring us he would search for the car and its occupants. But the maze-like layout of the park and the number of exits made it unlikely they would be caught. Even as the officer drove off to begin his search, I couldn't shake the fear that those men were still nearby, hiding just out of sight. We left the park as quickly as possible, the events of the day replaying in my mind on an endless loop. Who were they? What did they want? And why had they followed us so persistently? The questions were maddening, their lack of answers leaving me with an unsettling sense of vulnerability. Looking back, I feel immense gratitude for my husband's quick thinking and the kindness of the store employees who stayed by my side. Their actions reminded me that even in terrifying moments, there are good people willing to step in and help.